Lesson 2, Surface Water. In this lesson we're going to go through the characteristics of a river system, specifically what it is. We'll also talk about what are ponds and lakes, and then how lakes change over time. So a river system. A river system is a drainage system that gives a confined location for runoff to travel en route to a larger river or a lake. The picture you see here is the Grand River system, and that drains most of the area that we live in, and that area then eventually drains out to Lake Michigan. Tributaries. Tributaries are the streams and smaller rivers that feed into a main river. They flow downward towards the main river. They are pulled by the force of gravity. And a river and all the streams and smaller rivers that flow into it make up an entire river system. Here's another example of a river system, the Arkansas River system. The divide that occurs between the Pacific Ocean's water drainage and the Gulf of Mexico water drainage occurs at the Rocky Mountains. Everything to the east of the Rocky Mountains flows downstream towards the Mississippi River and then eventually out to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything on the west side of the Rocky Mountains flows towards the Pacific Ocean. And so this example right here shows the Arkansas River flowing all the way through Colorado into Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and then eventually it makes contact with the Mississippi River, where the water continues to drain out to the Gulf of Mexico. So watersheds. Just as all the water in a bathtub flows toward the drain, all the water in a river system drains into a main river. The land area that supplies water to a river system is called a watershed. Watersheds are also sometimes known as drainage basins. And again, this picture shows the Grand River watershed. You'll see the yellow color area is actually the Maple River watershed, and the Maple River watershed eventually dumps out into the Grand River. And there's a number of other watersheds that are smaller watersheds that are part of the larger Grand River watershed. Some other major watersheds found in the United States: the Mississippi River watershed, the Columbia River watershed in the Pacific Northwest, and the Colorado River watershed. Divides. A divide is a ridge of land that keeps one watershed separated from another. Streams on each side of the divide flow in opposite directions. The Great Divide, also known as the Continental Divide, is the longest divide in North America. It follows the line of the Rocky Mountains. West of the Rocky Mountains, water flows towards the Pacific Ocean. East of the Rocky Mountains, it flows towards the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River eventually dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So looking at this picture, we can identify a number of watersheds and a number of divides. The divides are the high land between watersheds. So a divide is here, 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 and here. Higher land that separates areas of water or areas of drainage are called divides. The watersheds are the low depressions where the water drains. So this is a watershed, and that, and that. All of these areas are areas where the land between divides drains out to a larger lake or river system. Ponds and lakes. Ponds we'll start out with. Ponds have water that is shallow enough for sunlight to reach the bottom. Because sunlight can reach the bottom, plants tend to grow throughout the entire pond. Plants, algae, and bacteria are found in ponds. Plants and algae produce oxygen as they use sunlight to make food. Bacteria break down waste products. and fish and other animals use the oxygen and food from plants to survive. So ponds can have a large variety of different organisms in them because of sunlight being able to penetrate. Lakes. Lakes are usually much larger and deeper, so very little sunlight reaches the very bottom of that body of water. It's difficult for plants to survive in the cold, deep lake bottom. Mollusks and worms tend to live in the sandy or rocky bottoms. They also eat food particles that drift by because of any type of flow of water or anything that sinks down from the surface. Young fish, such as pike and sturgeon, eat the tiny bottom-dwelling organisms, while the adult fish eat other fish. Inside of your notes, I'd like you to take a moment and complete this Venn diagram. In the center, we're going to have characteristics that are similar between ponds and lakes. Under the pond side, characteristics that are only representative of a pond, and under the lake side, only characteristics that are representative of a lake. Use the information from the last couple of slides to complete this. Lake formation. A river may bend and loop as it encounters obstacles in its path. Eventually a new channel might form, cutting off a loop and creating an oxbow lake. So this picture represents that. We get a loop that is formed. Eventually more and more materials are going to be eroded along this side and this side, and eventually we're going to create a loop that gets cut across. As the water changes directions and goes the new direction, an oxbow lake forms, a small U-shaped depression where water is still held. Some lakes, like the Great Lakes, are formed by depressions left behind by glaciers. So you can see in this picture, shows over time glaciers advance, cutting deep gouges into the ground. As temperature increases and those glaciers recede, they take sand and sediment from the surface of the ground with them, and it eventually leaves behind a large depression where water can hold. Other lakes were formed in valleys created by movements of Earth's crust. Lake Tanganyika in Africa is an example of that, where we have two plates that are moving apart from one another, so it creates a large depression in the ground where water fills in. Volcanoes can form lakes as lava or mud flows block the flow of a river, or just large depressions in the ground can fill up with water due to a volcanic explosion. Here's an example. And people can also create lakes by damming a river or stream, thereby creating a reservoir. So this is an example of Tippy Dam on the Manistee River. Some of you may be familiar with this area. The Tippy Dam blocks the flow of the Manistee River, and a large reservoir is held up above the river that is flowing downstream towards Lake Michigan. So using that information, which of the following would we consider a volcanic lake? A lake that was formed through glacial erosion, and also finally a lake that is formed through the movement of two plates moving apart from one another, creating a depression. The first one on the left is a volcanic lake. The middle one is a Great Lake formed by glacial movement. And the one on the right, that is a rift valley area where two plates are moving apart from one another. So how can lakes change? Natural processes and human activities cause lakes to disappear. One natural process is just the filling in of a lake or a pond through sediment deposition. Sediments are added to the bottom of a lake, slowly filling them in over time. The other process is called eutrophication. Eutrophication does require a series of steps. The first one is algae grows fast, using up a lot of the oxygen, and it also blocks out sunlight. You've probably seen this before, where an algae mat is at the surface. That algae mat is hard to see through. You don't see much of the water underneath or whatever else may be found underneath. If you can't see down there, sunlight is probably not penetrating. So those aquatic plants that are below begin to die. The dead matter provides food for microbes. It increases the competition for oxygen. So as microbes grow, they use up more oxygen, leaving less oxygen for larger fish and other organisms to have available to them. And the water becomes deoxygenated, and the fish eventually die. So over time, those dead materials eventually sink to the bottom. So again, as lake organisms die, bacteria break down the bodies and release nutrients into the water. These nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, are chemicals that other organisms need. Over time, nutrients can build up in the lake in a process called eutrophication, where algae use the nutrients and spread, forming a layer on the lake's surface. When the algae layer becomes too thick, it blocks out sunlight, and plants cannot carry out photosynthesis any longer. Eventually they die. Without food and oxygen from the plants, other organisms begin to die, and the decaying remains from dead organisms eventually fills in the lake. So the process of eutrophication, one more time. Organisms release wastes and nutrients into the water. Dead organisms pile up on the bottom of the lake, making it shallower. And over time, the lake becomes filled in, forming a meadow. Or it could be a small wetland, because there'd still be water below the surface, so it'd probably be fairly damp and spongy in that area. Humans do play a role in this process of eutrophication as well. Human activities can increase the rate of eutrophication. Fertilizer from farms can run off into ponds and lakes. This supplies an excess amount of nutrients to that body of water. The excess nutrients cause algae to grow, and the extra nutrients speed up the growth of algae, leading to faster eutrophication. Looking back at the water cycle, this should be a little bit of review from in the past. What you need to do inside of your notes in an area where you have a little bit of a blank. Diagram the water cycle using the different processes of evaporation, transpiration, runoff, condensation, and precipitation. Your examples should be different from mine, and your picture should be slightly different as well. So I started with precipitation. So runoff then forms, and runoff leads to a river system and groundwater. That eventually collects in lakes and oceans. The process of transpiration, where plants absorb that runoff water and then release it into the atmosphere, can occur. As water transpires into the atmosphere from plants, condensation can occur in the atmosphere. The water that collects in lakes and oceans can go through the process of evaporation. Evaporation causes water vapor to end up in the atmosphere. And then that evaporation eventually leads to condensation. Condensation then eventually becomes precipitation.
Clouds fill up and the rain falls down, water falling down to the ground, big drops, small drops all around, and we call it precipitation. When the water hits the ground, it runs off to the seas, fill the water way past your knees. Sunshine comes and heats it up, and this we call evaporation. It is a perfect cycle, and it's happening every single day. It is the water cycle. cycle. When the mist rises up from the sea, it goes against the force of gravity, collecting drops in great big clouds, and this we call condensation. When the clouds get heavy with all those drops, the cloud will fill till it pops, and the cloud bursts open and the rain comes down, and this we call precipitation. It is a perfect cycle. It's happening every single day. It's called the water cycle. Clouds fill up and the rain falls down, water falling down to the ground, big drops, small drops all around, and this we call precipitation. When the water hits the ground, it runs off to the seas, fill the water way past your knees. Sunshine comes and heats it up, and this we call evaporation. It is a perfect cycle, and it's happening every day. It's called the water cycle. When the mist rises up from the sea, it goes against the force of gravity, collecting drops in great big clouds, and this we call condensation. When the clouds get heavy with all those drops, the clouds will fill until they pop. Cloud bursts open and the rain comes down. You remember it's called precipitation. It is a perfect cycle, and it happens every single day. It's called the water cycle. It is a perfect cycle, and it's happening